hit record, so there we go. It seems like the rate of people joining has slowed down. So hello, everybody. My name is Wayne Unger. I'm a professor at Gonzaga University School of Law, where I study and research more than anything else the First Amendment, but broadly speaking, the Constitution, as well as the state constitutions across the country. And so today I was asked to talk a little bit about protecting privacy as a freedom of thought. As I learned a little bit about you all as the audience, it aligned well with my most recent research, which is talking about how the freedom of thought is as American, here's an idiom for you, as American as apple pie. Now, coincidentally, or I should say ironically, that saying is not actually American. That takes its roots, I believe, from England. But we have somebody from Nigeria. So we are really a global audience today, and I welcome you all, and I'm honored that you have decided to spend the next 28 minutes with me. So my goal with today's presentation is just to quickly review kind of how the First Amendment and these democratic freedoms and liberties that we talk about across the world, for that matter, tie into the work that you all do as librarians and archivists and information service professionals, etc. Certainly, I will welcome any questions in the chat, so you are more than welcome to send your questions, but my goal is also to leave ample time for your questions during a Q&A. With that said, yes, I did start recording, and we have to give a shout out, of course, to San Jose State University, and I coincidentally used to live right next to it. So the intellectual freedom, or the freedom of thought, and kind of how does it apply to kind of democratic principles in general? Well, there was a Supreme Court case here in the United States called West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett. And this case came right around World War II. And the most famous quote from this case, which I hold as probably one of the strongest and most artful quotes that the Supreme Court here in the United States has ever written, says, "If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein." I think the key to this quote, at least for today's conversation, is kind of in that last or second to last phrase, matters of public opinion, forcing citizens to confess by word or act, right? No government can prescribe what shall be orthodox in thought, really, if we think about it. So the freedom of thought, again, my work focuses on the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, which does say, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances." Now, these kind of freedoms and rights and liberties embodied in the First Amendment were not actually new to the United States at the time of the Revolution and the Constitution's ratification, drafting and ratification. These actually existed for a very long time, but it has ebbed and flowed if we look across history as far as, what does freedom of speech actually mean? But at least in today's term, it is overwhelmingly considered key prerequisites, so to speak, of democratic freedoms. That if we are to really govern ourselves, then kind of freedom of speech and the freedom of thought and the right to dissent are all fundamental rights that we must hold. So I'm going to talk a little bit about privacy theories for a second, and maybe unlike the previous sessions today, I'm going to be a little bit more theoretical and kind of talk through why is it that we protect privacy? Why should we protect privacy? And what does that look like in in kind of the information services realm. So the first I want to start actually is in the bottom right-hand corner here, with that circle that says presentation. So traditionally, we have thought about the First Amendment and the freedom of speech as something that protects the presentation of speech, right? So the very common idea of being able to protest on a public sidewalk, protest against your government, maybe even going further in an authoritarian regime where we have protests in Iran. Now, the presentation is what we have traditionally and historically have protected. And the theories underneath the presentation are self-governance, personal autonomy, and search for the truth, which is, to expand a little bit, if we are to govern ourselves, right, in a republic or in a democracy, then we need access to information, whether that's information about how societies operate around the world, or whether that's information regarding our elected officials, regardless of the level of government that we're talking about. Second is that personal autonomy. We need these rights, the right to dissent, the right to receive information in order to be theoretically autonomous in ourselves, to make our own decisions, to have our own thoughts be well informed. And that really hits on the third one as well, the search for the truth, where if we look at the traditional role of the press is a private check on government, insofar as their job is to inform the public. And when you inform the public, you are able to have the governed properly and effectively elect their governors. Okay, so that is the traditional theory of kind of these fundamental rights, the freedom of thought, for example. I want to go, actually, I know the arrows are a little bit out of order because I stole this from my research paper and I present this differently in the research paper. So for that, I apologize, but let's go to the top for a second and talk about the production. What we mean by production here, and this is inspired by Neil Richards, Professor Neil Richards' work, also a law professor and also a First Amendment scholar, also a privacy scholar for that matter. He does a lot. He has argued, and I agree, that the First Amendment should also protect the activities and the records associated with ideation, with contemplation, with those activities that I think, for example, archives, libraries, and similar institutions have a strong role in doing in society, or add that value to society. He calls this the intellectual privacy theory, that if we are to be intellectual, right, then the records and the activities associated with intellectualism should be protected as well. So very practical, he argues in his book, Professor Richards argues in his book, that we should protect library records, such as which books a guest might check out, right? Now, in today's more digital world, we have some other considerations for, what are we to protect if we are protecting intellectualism? I argue, for example, that internet search history could be well within the realm of production. So this idea that if we are to produce our ideas, right, and it leads to the presentation. So logically, if we protect the presentation, then we should also protect for those reasons, the self-governance, personal autonomy, and search for the truth. Then we should also protect over here the activities associated with the production of those ideas, thoughts, and beliefs that are protected by presentation. Now, in my most recent work, I look at the storage and access component as well. So this is really where I add the kind of the third side to the triangle, third corner to the triangle. And I argue that as data becomes more intimate, as we begin to learn and predict what people are actually thinking through technologies such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, and similar, or through actual brain decoding, which is, I would say, just recently, within the last 2 years or so, a technology that has gained steam is the development of, or the advanced development of brain-computer interfaces that, without going into a neuroscience and a neurotechnology rabbit hole, so to speak, long story short is we are on the verge of a new era in which we can actually actively decode brain signals, as well as a bunch of other neurotechnologies. So I argue all of that should also be protected, right? That if, for example, a technology platform can very accurately predict through machine learning or artificial intelligence what a user is thinking or what a user is contemplating, then in theory, we should protect that as well. And again, it kind of comes back to what is our role as librarians, archivists, information service professionals, et cetera. Well, if our role is to help inform society through the various services that we offer, then privacy should be protected insofar as we need to protect the production, so the ideation and the contemplation, and the records, the storage, and the access of what ideas, thoughts, and beliefs are actually saying. On the left-hand side, I really hit on those inherent freedoms, those that are read into very frequently and around the world, read into freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and kind of those democratic freedoms. And the first is the freedom of thought. And the second is the right to dissent. If we just look at American history for a second, and well, history around the world, actually, now that I think about it, when it comes to independence movements, right, revolutions, certainly in the American Revolution itself was a dissent against King George. And other countries around the world have done similar manners of dissent, or have manifested their dissent in similar ways. Second, or should be third, is the right to receive information and the right to a free mind. That if in society, again, we are to live in a society in which we elect our governors, and we seek personal autonomy and we seek the truth, then we should have a right to receive information, and we should have a right to think what we choose. Of course, the right to a free mind is often linked to religion and beliefs, but at least according to the United States Supreme Court and the appellate courts around the country, that right to a free mind is not limited to theology, or that freedom of religion is not limited to theology, insofar as it's really about a core set of beliefs, right? That you have a right to believe what you choose. And let's distinguish that from the right to act upon your beliefs. We know that the right to act upon your beliefs is not necessarily absolute, and that it can be a qualified, and often is around the world, a qualified right, where you have limitations on your actions. Now we think about authoritarian and totalitarian regimes as an example, where these do not flourish. And I've been told that I should give trigger warnings when I go down this example. So here's a trigger warning. I'm going to go back to World War II and Nazi Germany for a second. And Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler actually embody everything counter to what I've described. So looking historically again, in the very early days of Hitler rising to Chancellor of Germany, a lot of constitutional freedoms and rights were suspended within the first 6 months or so. And the goal, as we now know, looking back, the goal of the Nazi regime was to control thought, right? Control a person's mind by limiting the access of what he or she or they could obtain, the access to information, right? We limit that. So today, in my eyes, we manifest this in my eyes, again, very concerning ways, such as banning certain books. I came across a Barnes & Noble stand, actually. Barnes & Noble is a bookstore chain here in the United States, and they may have global locations as well. And they actually had a stand, and it said, read the books that are banned. And on this stand were just the books that were banned in libraries and states across the country, and the reasons for why they were banned. And as a child, I remember growing up and reading the famous poet, Shel Silverstein, if I said his first name correctly. It's been a little while since I read him. And that book was banned. And it just baffled me. So this idea that, again, if we are to inform, if we are to live an intellectual society, we really need everything on the left-hand, well, everything on the slide in general, but all the rights that you see on the left-hand side. So that's a quick overview. And like I said, I personally am one that doesn't like to go up to the very last minute and then do Q&As. So I welcome your questions. I will turn to the chat. With regard to predicting data, any thoughts on data that is, I gotta scroll, that is massaged? I'm going to assume the word massage here, as you use it, means processed. And correct me if I'm mistaken, but the freedom of thought in general does tie back to, of course, all types of data, and in various aspects of the life cycle of data. So what I mean by that is, if we take one step back and we look at how data flows. So data flows, it's in process, it's in storage, it's in collection. We have data collection, data processing, data storage, et cetera. That across the data lifecycle, and hopefully I answer your question here, across the data lifecycle, right, these privacy protections should exist. So not only in the data collection, but also in that data processing. Not only in the data processing, but also in that data flow as it's in transit, as it's moving. Darla says, not banned by public libraries, but by some school districts. I presume you are referring to books being banned, again, by school districts. And certainly it depends on how local school districts are formed within states and around the country and around the world, for that matter. The First Amendment, let's just take one step back. Here in the United States, the Constitution is read to only apply to governments, meaning, well, with the exception of the 13th Amendment, meaning that the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, the freedom of expression, right, the freedom of thought, these rights cannot be infringed by any government actor. And so that includes, right, public school officials and public school districts. As we saw in the West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett case, without going too far into it, it was about a mandatory flag salute and pledge of allegiance. And the Jehovah's Witnesses, a sizable religion, protested that and filed suit, arguing that they will not pledge allegiance to a flag, and rather God is their supreme that they would pledge allegiance to. Okay, I will also open this up. If you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, be my guest. Not 118 of you all at once. Okay, so then I'll go back to the chat question. With regard to data and civil rights, any thoughts on how the tech industry can better create an environment in upholding civil rights? Yes, I do have my thoughts on it. I've written somewhat extensively on this. And I think that when it comes to upholding civil rights by major tech platforms, that's dependent on the incentive structures that we create as a society. So be it that Twitter, Facebook, and the like are United States-based companies, let's focus on that for 1 second. In the United States, they are incentivized by being publicly traded companies to focus on the metrics, and they actually created these metrics, right? Daily active users, monthly active users, where in theory, those metrics tie back to the number of impressions that they get through their main source of revenue, their advertisements. And with that, they are incentivized by keeping eyes on the page, so to speak, and their Wall Street metrics of daily active users, monthly active users. They are incentivized to keep you engaged on their platform. So in one of my recent articles published by Columbia, I argued that the lack of privacy, right, the ability of tech platforms to collect all this data about a user and process that data in such a way to curate the content that they show you, that the platform shows you on a newsfeed, for example, has actually enabled democratic erosion insofar as affecting thought and belief across the country. So one of the most common questions that I'm asked is actually why, how can somebody believe, again, I'm sorry for all these American-centric examples, but how can someone believe that the 2020 presidential election was stolen? Well, if we look at putting aside the merits of that argument, if we just look at how this spread, right? Technology works in such a way to where if you click on something, then it's going to show you more of that something. And so under this freedom of thought and freedom of speech ideal that we have across the world, the idea is that ideas can be competing for to prevail in a marketplace of ideas. That concept of marketplace of ideas is very often used. My argument is that the lack of privacy, again, allowing platforms to collect as much data as possible on their users and then use that data in such a way to curate content, takes away from the marketplace of ideas. Insofar as if I am on Facebook 24 hours a day, as an example, I'm not, then I click on something and I kind of go down a rat hole of that something. That could be a conspiracy theory, that could be something actually factual, it could be whatever narrative that you can dream of right now. Facebook and other platforms are going to continuously show you that information because they know that's what keeps you engaged. And they are judged metrically off of those engagement numbers. So back to the original question, which was, how could we better create an environment with respect to the tech platforms in upholding civil rights? I think that comes back to we have to change the fundamental incentive model that exists. And I don't know how to do that necessarily, except for increasing the penalties for abusing that. So I argue for a private right of action, an individual's right to privately sue to sue a technology company for a violation of their privacy, their data privacy rights. Okay, several questions here. So let me quickly. I'm reading several, so hang on, bear with me here. So there is one or two questions here which are a little bit more legal focused, being that, can I get this information? Certainly email me. I'll switch to the side here. Email me and I can kind of answer those questions specifically. Norman, you asked, can you speak to a case like New York Times v. Sullivan and more generally where the First Amendment is a defense against the privacy torts? The issue has relevance to social media where shaming and insulting language inhibits speech and thought as well. I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at here, Norman, but I'll answer it this way. New York Times v. Sullivan is really about a press case. It's a freedom of the press case. But more generally, whether the First Amendment and those freedoms, whether they're a defense to privacy torts. Maybe you mean this in the realm of press invading privacy in order to publish, and how do we weigh that balance? That's a tough one. There's competing interests, as we know, that is kind of like the basis of constitutional law, is that these interests compete against each other. So we have to kind of decide based off of scrutinizing what is going on. But privacy torts and the freedom of the press, I'm going to separate them for a second. Tort law theoretically is about making a person who has been injured whole again. Whereas on the other hand, freedom of press, of course, is allowing the press to do their job in reporting and giving that information out to society. So the idea is, in a way, they're competing insofar as if there's an invasion of privacy, but they're trying to report, New York Times v. Sullivan says, hey, you need kind of an actual malice standard, right? The press must have actual malice in their reporting. And a reckless, on the defamation side, a reckless disregard for the truth. Privacy torts, I think we can still have a world in which privacy torts exist, and we do actually, and the freedom of the press exists insofar as torts, again, are a private litigant suing a press member or institution for an invasion of privacy. That person doesn't give up their privacy rights, right? It is one that courts have struggled with over the years, so there's no real definitive answer, but I hope that kind of sheds a little light. Peggy, I also think that private citizens have a right and the responsibility to demand that tech companies do better, much, much better. I agree. I'm just gonna put that out there. I agree. What are your thoughts on websites that you to make your choice in the cookies, but certain points cannot be deselected? Okay, it's a cookies question. So GDPR really led the charge. The Global Data Protection Regulation out of the European Union really led the charge on cookie banners. But what we're also seeing right now is this charge to look at what's called dark patterns. Dark patterns are user interface design. So a designer of a website homepage, for example, deliberately designing it in such a way that encourages the user to do what they want. So, of course, from a cookies perspective, especially if they make their money off of advertisements, and cookies are how they track users, well, the goal there is for the designer to create the cookie banner in such a way that encourages you to select all of them. And this is the most frustrating thing for me as a kind of privacy scholar as well. I go to a web page and it says, please select all your cookies. And you have to click 5 times just to say, I only want the necessary ones and not all of these other cookies. So I think what we'll see over the next 5 years, now to the next 5 years from now, 2027, is a push by regulators and legislatures to regulate the use of dark patterns. For example, California, and I forget which act it was under, but California has recently passed a law that says to cancel a subscription service, that cancel button must be made like in a very, easy to find and easy to read area, versus burying it or making users dig deep or having to chat with the person in order to cancel their subscription. So I think we're seeing regulation in that direction in which we do we regulate dark patterns and how we go. Okay.
Wayne, we've got to wrap up.
Well,
the closing keynote's about to start.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining. It's very difficult for me to fit a lot of research into 30 minutes. And I know you all have plenty of questions here, and I thank you for those. Please feel free to email me. My email is down there in the bottom right-hand corner, unger@gonzaga.edu. I'm more than happy to answer them to the best of my ability or refer you to resources where you can find it as well. Thank you, everybody.